Dramatic diplomatic breakthroughs in the Ukraine war as both sides of the conflict offer proposals to end the 3.5 year war this week. As part of a diplomatic build-up that's gone on and off for several years, actually since this conflict began, but now it looks like there is finally coming to some sort of conclusion. There are four major sides in the conflict: Russia and Ukraine, obviously, but also the two major allied blocs of Ukraine, the Americans and the Europeans, and they're also at odds. So we're going to see what the exact terms of the proposals are, who gains, who loses, and what's likely to be implemented. I'm Michael Streets. I've been to every single oblast of Ukraine, studying 6 different battlefronts on the ground. I study geopolitics from a realist perspective, and I record history of both military and diplomatic efforts. Now, let me give a summary of the conflict in as short a time as I can. I know that's quite difficult of such a vast armed struggle, but let's begin. The Russians felt, especially in the Russian government, that elements of eastern Ukraine were Russian-speaking and required annexation by Russia. It was felt that the fall of the Soviet Union, essentially, the country had been artificially stunted in a moment of historical weakness, and they wanted to take those territories back. Ukraine obviously would resist such proposals. It began with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and also varying intensity civil war in the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast in the east. And there were many times where this separatist struggle almost became direct conflicts with Russia. Russia also had a lot of influence in the Ukrainian government on and off throughout 1991 to 2014. Now, this situation was essentially intolerable for both sides because the control of Crimea and the threatening of the east crippled the Ukrainian economy. There was a lot of hyperinflation multiple times, and most importantly, controlling these sea lanes here meant that almost all of Ukraine's trade, which goes through this massive Dnieper River here, really couldn't proceed or were constantly obstructed. But for Russia, taking Crimea was not enough because the water supply of Crimea and also the electricity supply of Crimea is reliant on this river. So specifically, the fresh water comes from here, and also this Zaporozhye nuclear power plant supplies a critical amount of electricity to the area. So basically, the situation was strategic tension for both sides, and it was intolerable. It could have been negotiated. However, that's not what happened in 2022. There was an invasion by Russia, including through Belarus, whose main thrust, it was expected to be in the east, and they went for Kiev, including through Belarus. However, it was almost like a forward column strike force that was not intended for an armed struggle to take over a city of 3 million people. It was entirely reliant on the political collapse in Ukraine and instant capitulation. So basically, as you can see, they're almost sort of snaking in here with very little defense on their flanks. Same in, they also tried to come through the south, through crossing the river, taking Kherson, and almost like an individual column walking through. And that's because they expected no resistance, or they expected disjointed resistance. However, the Ukrainians rallied. The army very quickly started stabilizing the front, and soon it was obvious to the Kremlin that this was going to be a prolonged conflict. They withdrew from the north in this area, leaving behind a lot of their heavy equipment, which is currently in Kiev as a sort of open-air museum of all these captured or abandoned tanks, all-terrain vehicles, artillery pieces. Very interesting to look at. And then followed by a focus on the east. There was also an attempt at Kharkiv, and historically, over the last 100 years, ever since this area became industrialized, you can't take the industrially rich area of Donbass without taking Kharkiv and also Mariupol. Those are the two hinges on which all of this relies, and so you need to take both. In World War II, Kharkov was heavily fought over, and it was regarded as extremely strategic. It was once the capital of Ukraine, actually. So, because the Ukrainians kept this, it was regarded as this was guaranteed to be a stalemate, essentially. The Ukrainians again had multiple more offensives, resulting in the Russians leaving Kharkiv Oblast, or most of it, and also Kherson, and having a sort of defensive line on this river. And then there was a sort of World War I style stalemate. The Russians pushed in multiple times in the east, having multiple victories, with huge losses of life, with frontal wave assaults and drone warfare. But frankly, a victory by what standard? Because the area has been totally depopulated, not just from the conflict, but just because people are moving. People have left to abroad, but also to the west of Ukraine. And so going around these, it's like they're fighting over literal fields that are completely economically unproductive. And so this war, where right off the bat, about $500 billion minimum of international Russian assets were frozen. You're fighting over a field at the expense of hundreds of billions of dollars. The mathematics and economics of these assaults don't make sense. At the same time, Ukraine launched an assault into the Kursk area, the city of Kursk, which is another key point in the eastern front of World War II, as a sort of political move to show that they're not defeated and they can continue to fight here, all that sort of stuff. They got pushed back. This was famously where the North Koreans joined in the fight on the Russian side. And so for the last probably 2 years, there's been this stalemate. It's strategically inviable for both because, as I said, Crimea is vulnerable to their water and electricity supply, and also the Ukrainian economy is crippled by Russian interdiction of sea trade here and the removal of the Dnieper River as a trade source. So that's the context of the front. There's a lot of fatigue in both sides, and it's remarkably similar actually to another conflict that the US got involved in, the Korean War. North Korea thought they wanted to reunify, just like the Russians thought they could reunify with Donbass. They invaded, they got pushed back, stalemate for multiple years, and then there was a freezing of the front lines and an armistice without a formal treaty, which is what looks like is highly likely for this conflict. But without further ado and without any spoilers, let's go into that. So the Americans, who have had a testy, almost reluctant relationship with the Ukrainians ever since the new administration took over, have been offering a peace plan that's a 28-point peace plan. The Europeans and Ukrainians then offered a counter-proposal, and they've met in the middle with some concessions. So let's see what each point is involved in that. Okay, so this is basically, there was a Istanbul meeting 2 years ago that was not very successful. There was an Alaska meeting that the media said didn't happen or didn't result in anything concrete, but all of a sudden there's this new diplomatic breakthrough. So a lot of stuff happens behind the scenes. And almost always the leaders will not talk about a treaty until you've got the finished product. So that's why, Trump's been talking about it, but that's why there's been no big meetings between Putin and Trump and Putin and Zelensky, and because they basically don't want to be embarrassed. Neither of the three sides want to be embarrassed, so they want to have something concrete. So as soon as you start having a meeting between the major leaders, that's when you know that there's going to be a deal closed. So number one, Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. Well, right off the bat, with any of these treaties, it's the definition of words. Some people will say that sovereignty means across all territories, but that, in this context, it's an independent state, which the Russians have never really disagreed with. They, in some major plans, like the sort of new Russia plan, they take the Odessa Oblast and have a buffer state or a puppet state, maybe. But there's been very few Russian plans of a full annexation of Ukraine. So you start off with something that both sides can win, and they can feel that they can take a win, and that's a good way of getting into the harder stuff later on. So, a comprehensive non-aggression agreement will be concluded between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Europe, defined here probably as Britain plus EU, but then you've got NATO as well. Britain's out of the EU, but a key member of NATO. So I'm going to assume that means EU plus UK. All ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. There's been many treaties between Ukraine and Russia about this. So Ukraine abandoned a lot of its nuclear arsenal in the 90s in exchange for a Russian promise of non-aggression. The Russians also guaranteed the sovereignty of many of the former Soviet states in exchange for no NATO expansion. And so both of those agreements have been torn up. So let's see. Ambiguities usually means both territory and economic. It is expected that Russia will not invade neighbouring countries, and NATO will not expand further. So Ukraine's trying to apply for NATO, but frankly, this is a defeat, I think, for Russia, because Russia is not planning to invade the Baltic states or Finland. They learned their lesson in 1940 or 1939 with Finland, and Belarus is in the Russian sphere. That pretty much leaves Georgia, and they have a lot of control over Georgia. In exchange, NATO will not expand further. Well, they've already expanded during the war. Finland, Sweden, and so, you know, it's almost like confirming NATO expansion rather than saying they will not expand further. I should have included a map of new NATO countries. In fact, I'll do that now very briefly. NATO. So as you can see, this is the Russian border with Finland, and it adds about 1,000 kilometers of territory that the Russians need to defend. So there's actually, Finland might be a small country, but it's strategically very important to Russia, and it also threatens St. Petersburg as well. And so they've had to spend billions of dollars putting in defenses all along this border. So I think this is a win for NATO. Russia has basically agreed to these Trump's terms, by the way. And I say it's Trump. I mean, the media likes to put it all on one person, like it's a drama or a soap opera. But I mean, there's many people involved in the negotiations. A dialogue will be held between Russia and NATO, mediated by the United States. I'm not sure how you can mediate something you're a part of, but still, to resolve all security issues and create conditions for de-escalation. There's an element of Trump where China is the main rival. And so having this China-Russia axis or China-Russia-Iran axis that's been solidified recently by the war is something that Trump's not happy with. And so there's probably going to be an exchange of some sort of de-escalation with the partnership between Russia and China in exchange for accepting some of these terms. Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. Well, you know, there's no way they wouldn't accept that, and it would be delusional to have Ukraine be truly neutral and truly demilitarized at this point. In 2022, the Russian terms were a cessation of these 5 oblasts, so Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk and Luhansk, and in exchange for demilitarization and committed neutrality. That was the rules. It looks as though They're going to get basically half that territory and no true demilitarization, but we'll get into that in a bit. The size of the Ukrainian armed forces will be limited to 600,000 personnel. Again, this is just like NATO will not expand further. See there it says there. So it was about 250,000 before the war. So they're basically allowing the Ukrainians to host an army that can easily defend the country. Again, currently it's 850. It peaked at probably 1.2 million, but that doesn't include frontline troops. So 600,000 personnel is enough to defend the country, especially as it increases in quality, as it gets more and more funding from the Europeans, which is going to happen no matter what. One of the confirmations of this conflict and the 2024 thing, for example, the 2024 invasion, they took Crimea, but Russia lost all its influence in Kiev. And so they're doing that again. So even if they take this territory, Ukraine will pretty much permanently be part of the European sphere. So I think that's another win for Ukraine. Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted into the future. Okay, this is a win for Russia. But if you combine this massive military, and again, this is just personnel. It doesn't include drones. I mean, we're talking about modern warfare here. There's more than just boots on the ground that matter to security and defense. What if they're currently outproducing Russia in terms of drones. And so what if this 600,000 personnel includes triple the number of drones that Russia has? There's no limits to that in this agreement. So I think, again, this is a fake concession from a realist perspective, and doesn't really limit Ukraine's freedom of maneuver. On top of that, previously the agreements were as there'd be French and British troops on the western side of the country, not in the eastern side, and not even American troops. So this is a sort of negotiating tactic where now they're playing good cop, bad cop, and they're now saying NATO agrees to station no troops in Ukraine. So technically a win for Russia, but compared to what? What was the situation in 2022? This was unthinkable in 2022. So I think that combined with an army of this size is more than enough for Ukraine's security. And on top of that, it's more acceptable to domestic political consensus in America and in Europe. There was also an agreement that European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. Well, frankly, I've been throughout Poland and I've seen a lot of military equipment all over Poland. There was an agreement here that no nukes will be stationed in Poland. So Axios has got it a little bit wrong. And they've agreed to that, and the Americans and Europeans have agreed to that. But basically, what does that even mean? Because, you know, Britain has nukes, France has nukes. What does it matter if Poland, you know, has nuclear weapons? The range of these missiles is easily enough to strike into Russia from these two countries. So I really don't think it matters where the nukes are positioned. The Cuban Missile Crisis has an entire ocean away, so that's totally different. So anyway, another symbolic concession. The US will receive compensation for the guarantee of Ukraine's security. We don't know what specifically it is. It's probably this rare earth minerals thing, which I think is another red herring, because Ukraine may have 5% of the world's rare earths, but the Russians have occupied half of that reserve. So they really only have 2.5%. So if you want the rare earths, you deal with Russia, because they probably have another 10% of the world's supply. So that's basically 12.5% versus 2.5%. So it's in America's interest, if their desire is to get these minerals, to do a deal with Russia rather than Ukraine. But I think, you know, Trump needs to look like he's being paid. So that's a symbolic win for America. If Ukraine invades Russia, it will lose the guarantee. This is a bit of a loss for Ukraine because it means that Russia doesn't need to fortify all of this sort of stuff. And they had some daring operations where they have sabotage operations of military facilities deep into Russia, even thousands of miles into Siberia. I mean, some of the attacks were like over here and here, or in this area near Finland. So Ukraine not being allowed to do that is a major concession on behalf of the Western allies. If Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to a decisive coordinated military response, all global sanctions will be reinstated, recognition of territory will be revoked. That's fair enough. If Ukraine launches a missile into Moscow or St. Petersburg, which they've done multiple times, the security guarantee will be deemed invalid. Fair enough. Ukraine is eligible for EU membership. This is another reason why I think this NATO bloc is irrelevant, and will receive short-term preferential access to the European market while this issue is being reconsidered. Well, again, you have almost all the benefits alongside EU membership that you can imagine. And so NATO is almost like combined with the intelligence sharing and the funding of this army, it's a total win for the West. So they're basically going to have an army of 600,000 men funded with European money, so the EU citizens don't have to lose any lives in the war, while having a massive army against Russia. So the EU access is really all Ukraine needs, in addition to all this financing. And by the way, a note about sanctions. This treaty does not say what sanctions are going to be removed in terms of this deal. So we'll see. It gets to that later. There will be a powerful global package of measures. So basically, there'll be a lot of money that goes into Ukraine. And that was pretty much guaranteed no matter what happens. Infrastructure development. And here we are. Lifting of sanctions will be discussed and agreed upon on stages on a case-by-case basis. I think if Russia had a strong negotiating hand, they'd say, okay, remove them immediately. But they're not. So I can't see how this is a Russian victory, which is how the news media reported it around the world. It's like Trump's caving to Russia, all this sort of stuff. Where is the caving? They're not even allowing full lifting of sanctions. Russia will be re-invited to join the G8, meaning they have a seat on the negotiating table. And here we go. Frozen funds will be used as follows. 100 billion of frozen Russian assets will be invested in US-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. So right off the bat, not only is Russia not having all their sanctions lifted, but they're having to give up 100 billion. About 500 billion has already been taken, and it's frozen, but they haven't been spending it. And so this has been a long-standing request of the Ukrainians and the Europeans to have some of this money to put into the war machine and to the economic development. So the Russians agreed to have 100 billion, which, I mean, surely that's a big concession, no? And then here's about Trump getting paid. The US will receive 50% of the profits for the venture. Europe will allow 100 billion to increase the amount available. So there's 200 billion, half Ukraine, half European. That's quite significant stimulus package, although, I mean, the country's been so devastated. But I want to put in a separate video of how Taiwan and, in particular, South Korea both ended military conflicts with an armistice without an official peace treaty and became, including losing territory, but became massively economically successful after that. You know, especially South Korea. You look at North Korea versus South Korea. That armistice was very good for South Korea in the long run. And they totally recuperated all the losses that they had from the war. Okay, so the Russians and the Americans will talk to each other and ensure compliance, which is bog standard of all these sorts of treaties. But note, it's not direct Ukraine-Russia working group. It's very difficult for a Ukrainian politician to talk to Russia at the moment. In fact, they've enshrined in law you can't negotiate The government of Ukraine can't negotiate with Russia while Putin's president. That's the law in Ukraine, and so they'll need to change that in order to fix this. Um, Russia will enshrine in law its policy of non-aggression towards Europe and Ukraine, so no further territorial expansion. But the population now is so anti-Russian, the Russians would be crazy to try and push into that. It was thought that Odessa had a large Russian-speaking population, so you talk to Ukrainians in Odessa, they'll say "spasibo" and stuff like that, but they're totally against being part of Russia. They think it's backward and they want to be involved in Europe. So having this guarantee of no expansion, the more they expand now, the Russians, the more difficult it's going to become for public order. The United States and Russia will agree to extend the validity of treaties of non-proliferation, which is fine. I mean, I think honestly it's a kind of fake issue, this whole nuclear stuff. It was never used in the Cold War, and it's a sort of frankly, the boomer generation is scared of nuclear weapons. You now have North Korea and Russia involved in this war, and no nukes have been used, and so they're not going to be used. The consequences of using a nuclear weapon on another country will be devastating for the diplomatic reputation of that state. So no one's going to use it. It's not worth it. But we welcome a renewal of these treaties, which America and only America unilaterally cancelled previously. Ukraine agrees to be a non-nuclear state. I mean, that's fine. They've been like that since the 1990s. Bill Clinton talked about his regret for pushing through that deal that had Ukraine lose all its nuclear weapons, and there's debate would Russia have invaded in 2022 if Ukraine had nukes. I think that's by the by. And if you want to have a realist perspective, you have to look at troops on the ground and the reality on the ground now. Here we go back to the strategic tension that I talked about before. The Zaporozhye nuclear power plant will be equally distributed 50-50 with Ukraine and Russia. And it's basically a huge dam plus this nuclear power plant. And it's awesome to see. It's huge, very vulnerable though. So now, again, that's another incentive for Russia and Ukraine to have peace because they don't want to damage that agreement. Both countries undertake... so this was what was part of this Russian thing where, like, no Nazism in Ukraine. They say it's all Nazi. I mean, whatever that means. They have a different definition every week. And basically they're using it to justify the invasion because in Russia, similar to over here, everything you don't like is called a Nazi, and including the Ukrainian army, which is very debatable, to put it lightly. Both countries undertake educational programs to have tolerance of the different cultures. Frankly, I think that's more aimed at Ukraine. So Ukraine will adopt EU rules on religious tolerance. The Russian language has been heavily restricted in Ukraine over the last couple of years, and also the Russian Church, or Russian Orthodox Church, many of them have been shut down. And, frankly, they've been legally... there's been a lot of lawfare against the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So this applies more to Ukraine than it does to Russia. They'll agree to abolish all discriminatory measures, that sort of thing. Ukrainian and Russian media and education. I remember I was talking to someone in Poltava Oblast here, and she'd just gone to the movies with her mother, and the main one in the cinema was this movie called Bye Bye Russia. so it shows the sort of stuff that they got to watch over there. They're really, anything moderately understanding of either side is strictly banned on both sides. Yeah, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, here's one of the main points of contention. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States. This is very difficult for Ukraine to admit to, because then they asked, what's the point of fighting these 3 years? And I'll leave that for you to answer. But essentially, Ukraine continues to control elements of these oblasts around Kramatorsk, and but it's very small aspects of the oblast. So this would involve a freezing of the lines here, and Russia and Ukraine gives this little bit here to Russia. Um, Russia will relinquish all other agreed territories outside of those 5 regions, which basically means they'll give up this slither of land here, this little bit here. Um, and yeah, very difficult for Ukraine, and the Ukrainians rejected this proposal. So did the European Union. They agreed not to have any changes by force. Russia will not prevent Ukraine from using the Dnieper River for commercial activities. Free transport of grain across the Black Sea. There was an agreement mediated by Turkey that solidified this in 2022, but or 2023 perhaps, but this was quickly invalidated. I mean, it was too difficult to decide what's a military ship and what's a transport ship and civilian ship, and basically the only way this is going to happen is if the wider war ceases. But that's going to be really important for the Ukrainian economy. Humanitarian committee to resolve outstanding issues. Prisoner exchange, all for all, excellent, which means basically a complete transfer of all prisoners. Family reunification program. There's been a lot of accusations that the Russians have kidnapped children because they think it's, they're Russian babies. The validity of this sort of stuff has been widely debated, and I don't really want to get into that now, but I'm glad that there's going to be a return of the prisoners and the children, and alleviating the victims. And every single village I went to in Ukraine, there's a military cemetery where men have died. So the conflict, and this is literally in the rural hamlets, these things happen, and these you can see these gravestones. So every area of the country has been massively affected by this, trench attritional warfare. Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. This is another point of contention. Basically, Zelensky, he had a 5-year term starting in 2019. So it's literally his term has expired as president, and he's just continued being president for many months after that. He's got several political rivals at the moment. The main contenders are the guy called in the army Zaluzhny and the mayor of Kiev, Vladimir Klitschko. And it's basically difficult for him to maintain power without using emergency decrees. So they'll hold elections, and we'll see how that goes. But then the Russian position there is we can't negotiate with him because he's seized power. Well, that's the Russian position. So we'll see. So basically, Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days, which is important. All parties involved in the conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or complaints in the future. This is a big topic, and it's very important to stop sort of blood vendettas and make sure there's not 100 years of animosity between the two countries. It's very difficult to see how there won't be, but this would be a big step to avoid future escalation. And any violations, there'll be a lot of sanctions. Finally, once all parties agree to this memorandum, the ceasefire will take effect immediately after both sides retreat to agreed points to begin implementation of the agreement. Well, there was the original draft of this 28-point plan. It was panned by the Europeans and by Zelensky himself, mostly because of the withdrawal of in territory in the east and recognition of these territories. But frankly, even though the Ukrainians can absolutely withstand Russian attacks now, and there's zero chance that Ukraine will be conquered, it's also very difficult to see how they can retake all of the territories that they've lost since 2014. And on top of that, but then you have to add, it's politically extremely difficult for anyone in the Ukrainian government to allow any cessation of territory. So let's look at the European counterproposal. I won't read every single thing, but it's a joint Ukrainian counterproposal, Ukrainian-European counterproposal, and I'll just read the main differences. These two are the exact same. The point 3, that NATO will not expand further and Russia will not invade its neighbours, is invalidated. So basically they're insisting that Ukraine be allowed to join NATO. And as I said before, in the treaty, it's not that isolating for Ukraine to not be in NATO, because they're going to be allowed a significant army and full economic access to Europe and full funding for Europe, so they can increase their quality massively. But they say no, we want to join NATO, which I think is foolish because it just provokes Russia on one of their key points. And again, we talked about how the Ukrainians can't allow politically the cessation of territory. The Russian government cannot allow politically Ukraine to join NATO, because then that would basically look like they've totally lost the war. So in order for any treaty to be successful, both parties need to look like they've had wins. Ukraine will receive robust security guarantees. Yes, that's obvious. So they've increased the cap on the Ukrainian military from 600,000 to 800,000. You know, this is debatable, but again, I said Ukraine can absolutely defend themselves with 600,000 men, especially as they get more high tech and more high quality over time with all this European funding. Ukraine joining NATO depends on consensus of NATO members, which does not exist. Specifically, Hungary would veto it. And again, that's another issue of joining NATO. Right now, as the deal stands, a large, high-quality army with hundreds of billions of European money and Russian money would secure Ukraine's sovereignty. But, you know, if they want to join NATO, they want to join NATO. NATO agrees not to permanently station troops under its command in Ukraine in peacetime. Well, permanently, what does temporary mean? So basically they're saying allow NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. Fighter jets in Poland, that's fine. US guarantee that mirrors Article 5, that's pretty much already in the agreement. Compensation is the same. The forfeits are the same. Sanctions being restored if Russia invades Ukraine is the same. Eligible for there's no way Ukraine is not going to be in the European EU bloc after this war, no matter whether they do a treaty or not. More funding for Ukraine. In the economic side, that's all the same. Russia will be progressively reintegrated in the global economy. I mean, if I was in a Russian government, I'd say, it would be totally difficult to accept a full lifting of the sanctions, because what does progress mean? Maybe they have a specific agreement, maybe they don't, but it seems to me that that's a major concession from Russia. Again, case-by-case basis of sanctions. United States will enter into a long-term economic cooperation agreement to have all of the above developed. Well, again, that's another thing that was almost guaranteed no matter what happens with Russia. In fact, if Russia continues the war, there's probably going to be more funding for Ukraine, because this is it's a fair offer. So if Russia rejects this, then there's all the impetus for the Western allies to go double down on Ukraine. Again, this Reuters article, again, you can't really trust the media, but last time it was very specific. $100 billion of Russian frozen assets will be given to Ukraine for reconstructed, which really is a massive amount and a big concession from Russia's part. Although that being said, the Russians probably believe that the whole $500 billion has already been stolen, or whatever you want to call it, so they might as well give $100 billion that's going to be lost anyway. Extending non-proliferation. This is the same. This is the same. But clearly, what Ukraine has counter-offered is basically a complete freezing of the lines and not having this part given up, because it really is a sore point and is regarded as a capitulation, to be frank. Ukraine commits to not recover its occupied sovereign territory through military means. That's a big concession in addition to freezing the lines. So in exchange for not giving up this territory, they commit to not attacking any of this, which is quite significant, and shows that the Ukrainians are willing to end the war, because all the rhetoric from a lot of the politicians in Ukrainian Europe has been no treaties, no deals. We want a complete withdrawal of Russian troops from the 2014 Ukrainian borders, including Crimea. But looks like they're softening on this. Dnieper River is fine, and Ukraine will hold elections as soon as possible, not the 100 days. Everything else is pretty much the same. And so even though there was much huffing and puffing about rejecting Trump's deal, this one that they've said is really quite similar. The only big difference is minor changes of refusal to cede this territory, and also joining NATO, which I think, when you look at a realist perspective, the benefits outweigh the costs at the moment. But then they came back and said a sort of compromise deal where it says a pure cessation of hostilities on a Korea-style armistice line would be interesting. I think this is pretty much agreed to. The only remaining thing is joining NATO, and I think ultimately the Ukrainians will probably agree. See, this is how the media is different. All of a sudden it says 400 to 600,000, which is not what was proposed. It was 600,000. And so, yeah, and I think the big contention where Crimea will be recognized, I mean, why do they need to take the political pain of recognizing Crimea as Russian? Why can't they just accept a armistice without officially recognizing it as Russian? Just say this is the armistice line of the front, and we commit to not using the use of force. That's what happened in Korea, and South Korea is now an extremely wealthy country. So those are the main terms at the moment. It's very similar to what was discussed before, and it really hinges on the Russians have essentially agreed to the plan, by the way, including giving 100 billion to Ukraine. Now, what does this mean? It essentially means that I would regard this as a victory for the West, because originally, if you think about it, in 2022, it was viewed as guaranteed that the whole of Ukraine is in Russia's sphere, and they will easily invade, win pitched battles in the field, and take over almost all of this. Kharkiv was regarded as a key future Russian city. And so compared to now, Ukraine, the vast majority of Ukrainian territory will be in the European sphere. And then the question is, will there be a split between the EU and the Americans over this sort of issue? The only remaining, and on top of that, this land, the economic advantages of this land compared to what it was thought of 3.5 years ago, are totally irrelevant now. All the industry's been destroyed and it's outdated. It's from the Soviet Union anyway. Some of this stuff is from the 1960s and 70s. I saw industrial equipment that was rusted and literally from the time of Brezhnev. So they're invading over something that is just absolutely not economically worth it, and that's why they've said the Russians have said we'd rather pay $100 billion for rather than lose all of our $500 billion of reserves that have been frozen. It's close to 600 billion. And so, I mean, if that doesn't count as war reparations, I don't know what does, really. So Ukraine has a very bright future in the European sphere. They are quite well aligned, and because Ukraine has a educated but well, frankly, low wage relative to Europe population. Europe has a lot of capital and a lot of population density. Ukraine has a lot of landmass, and so I think they're going to be really good in the future. And Ukraine has buried the hatchet with their old rival Poland as well during this conflict, where they were always enemies before. The reason why Ukraine wasn't an independent state in 1917 after the Russian Revolution was because Poland invaded, and so they couldn't defend themselves against the Soviet Union. On top of that, NATO has won by expanding through to Finland and Sweden, more constricting Russia even more, and the Arctic route is going to be much more important over the next few decades, so that's quite strategically important. Moldova, which was regarded as a battleground between Russian and European influence, is now strongly in the European column. Transnistria, this little strip here that has Russian troops in it, is basically completely strangled, and they'll probably be taken over by Moldova at the end. I'm surprised that this treaty doesn't include anything in Moldova. The Russians include Belarus, but the Belarus was already in the Russian faction before, and so basically the Russians have accepted this deal, and they certainly haven't gained from the war. Obviously, Ukraine hasn't either, but they now understand that it's important to reintegrate into the global economy. Probably the European Union will continue to embargo a lot of Russian business, and it'll be difficult for Russia to do business in Europe, even if there's not official sanctions. But I think it's going to be very important for Russia to be reintegrated into the global economy, because you can't just have the stick, you need the carrot as well. Because if it's all just offense with no potential benefit, a state is going to get defensive and lash out. And the more sanctions there are, the more Russia will build up its domestic industry. So, for example, Iran now doesn't care about sanctions because they've been sanctioned for so long. They've just built up their domestic industries and they don't really care anymore. So let's see if both sides accept this as a framework going forward. And I think if there is a Korea-style armistice along the front lines, Ukraine can absolutely bounce back from this, be part of the European community, and have a very bright future ahead of it. Thank you so much for listening, and subscribe, comment, anything I missed out, anything I should add, anything you agree or disagree with, and we'll be delighted to hear from you.